guys, it's Miss Checka. I am here with you on this beautiful day to read Madeline L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time. And today we're going to go to chapter 9, which is on page 159. So a lot of things happen in the last chapter, but this chapter is called It. So we know something big is going to happen, but also this whole book, the Murray kids and their friend Calvin have been looking for their missing father. And the very last thing that we saw was Meg shouting out, "Father." Okay, so let's see what happened. All right, chapter 9. Meg rushed at the man imprisoned in the column, but as she reached what seemed to be the open door, she was hurled back as though she had crashed into a brick wall. Calvin caught her. "It's just transparent like glass this time," he told her. "We can't go through it." Meg was so sick and dizzy from the impact that she could not answer. For a moment, she was afraid she would throw up or faint. Charles Wallace laughed again, but the laugh was not his own, and it was this that saved her, for once more anger overcame her pain and fear. Charles Wallace, her own dear Charles Wallace, never laughed at her when she hurt herself. Instead, his arms would go quickly around her neck and he would press his soft cheek against hers in loving comfort. But the demon Charles Wallace snickered. She turned away from him and looked again at the man in the column. "Oh, Father," she whispered longingly, but the man in the column did not move to look at her. The horn-rimmed glasses, which had always seemed so much a part of him, were gone, and the expression of his eyes were turned inward, as though he were deep in thought. He had grown a beard, and the silky brown hair was shot with gray. His hair, too, had not been cut. It wasn't just the overlong hair of the man in the snapshot at Cape Canaveral. It was pushed back from his high forehead and fell softly almost to his shoulders, so that he looked like someone in another century, or a shipwrecked sailor. But there was no question, despite the change in him, that he was her father, her own beloved father. "My, he looks a mess, doesn't he?" Charles Wallace said, and sniggered. Meg swung on him with sick rage. "Charles, that's Father. It's Father." "So what?" Meg turned away from him and held out her arms to the man in the column. "He doesn't see us, Meg," Calvin said gently. "Why? Why?" "I think it's sort of like those little peepholes they have in apartments in the front doors," Calvin explained. "You know, from inside you can look through and see everything, and from outside you can't see anything at all. We can see him, but he can't see us." "Charles," Meg pleaded, "let me in to Father." "Why?" Charles asked placidly. Meg remembered that when they were in the room with the man with red eyes, she had knocked Charles Wallace back into himself when she tackled him, and his head cracked the floor, so she hurled herself at him. But before she could reach him, his fist shot out and punched her hard in the stomach. She gasped for breath. Sickly, she turned away from her brother back to the transparent wall. There was the cell, and there was her father inside. Although she could see him, although she was almost close enough to touch him, he seemed farther away than he had been when she had pointed him out to Calvin in the pictures on the piano. He stood there quietly as though frozen in a column of ice, an expression of suffering and endurance on his face that pierced into her heart like an arrow. "You say that you want to help, Father?" Charles Wallace's voice came from behind her with no emotion whatsoever. "Yes, don't you?" Meg demanded, swinging around and glaring at him. "But of course, that's why we're here." "Then what do we do?" Meg tried to keep the franticness out of her voice, trying to sound as drained a feeling as Charles Wallace, but nevertheless ending on a squeak. "You must do as I have done and go in to it," Charles said. "No." "Well, I can see you don't really want to save Father." "How will my being a zombie save Father?" You will just have to take my word for it, came the cold, flat voice from Charles Wallace. It wants you, and it will get you. Don't forget that I, too, am part of it now. You know, I wouldn't have done it if it weren't the right thing to do. Calvin, Meg asked in agony, will it really say father? But Calvin was paying no attention to her. He seemed to be concentrating with all his power on Charles Wallace. He stared into the pale blue eyes, into the pale blue that was all that was left of Charles Wallace's eyes. And for thou wast a spirit too delicate to act to her earthy and abhorred commands, she did confine thee into a cloven pine, he whispered. And Meg recognized Mrs. Who's words to him. Okay, I'm going to refresh you for just a second because it's been a while since we talked about this part in the book. But if you will remember, Mrs. Who was it? Mrs. Who, well, that makes sense. She's the one who always does the quotes. Mrs. Who had given Calvin a hint, and it was the lines from The Tempest. And remember, we said that was the play about that Shakespeare wrote that has like the sorcerer with the daughter and the crash landing and the shipwreck and so on and so forth, the big storm. Well, I'm just gonna refresh you here that there was in the play a witch named Sycorax. So I'm gonna draw her with like the witch hat, and a magical sprite named Ariel, who I am representing here with a sparkle, and Sycorax imprisons Ariel into a pine tree. See? So Sycorax imprisons Ariel into the pine tree, and then in the play, the sorcerer, whose name is Prospero, comes and frees Ariel from the pine. Yay! But then he just like makes Ariel do all of he treats him like a slave or a servant. So, but let's try and figure out why Calvin is now thinking about these lines from Shakespeare. Thou wast a spirit too delicate. That's talking about Ariel, to act her earthy and abhorred commands. That's Sycorax is the her, right? Abhorred means hateful, terrible. She did confine thee. So she is Sycorax and thee is Ariel into a cloven pine. Okay. For a moment, Charles Wallace seemed to listen to him. Then he shrugged and turned away. Calvin followed him, trying to keep his eyes focused on Charles's. If you want a witch, Charles, he said, it's the witch, not Our Lady's. Good thing I had the Tempest at school this year, isn't it, Charles? It was the witch who put Ariel in the cloven pine, wasn't it? Charles Wallace's voice seemed to come from a great distance. Stop staring at me. Breathing quickly with excitement, Calvin continued to pin Charles Wallace with his stare. You're like Ariel in the cloven pine, Charles, and I can let you out. Look at me, Charles. Come back to us. Okay, so Calvin is now thinking like, okay, I understand what Mrs. Who is trying to tell me, that it is like the witch Sycorax, and that Charles Wallace is like Ariel, and this mind control business is like him being stuck in the pine tree, the cloven pine. Again, Charles shuddered, and then it was though an invisible hand had smacked against his chest and knocked him to the ground, and the stare with which Calvin had held him was broken. Charles sat there on the floor of the corridor, whimpering. Not a small boy sound, but a fearful animal noise. Calvin, Meg turned on him, clasping her hands intensely, tried to get to father. Calvin shook his head. Charles almost came out. I almost did it. He almost came back to us. Try father, Meg said again. How? Well, your cloven pine thing. Isn't father imprisoned in a cloven pine even more than Charles? Look at him in that column there. Get him out, Calvin. Calvin spoke in an exhausted way. Meg, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to get in. Meg, they're asking too much of us. Okay, so Calvin thinks that he had it figured out, but now Meg is like, The column is like the pine tree, and the dad is like Ariel, trapped in there, right? So she's like, I got it. Mrs. Who's spectacles, Meg said suddenly. Mrs. Who had told her to use them only as a last resort, and surely that was now. She reached into her pocket, and the spectacles were there, cool and light and comforting. With trembling fingers, she pulled them out. Give me those spectacles. Charles Wallace's voice came in a harsh command, and he scrambled off the floor and ran at her. She barely had time to snatch off her own glasses and put on Mrs. Who's, and as it was, one earpiece dropped down her cheek and they barely stayed on her nose. As Charles Wallace lunged at her, she flung herself against the transparent door, and she was through it. She was in the cell with the imprisoning column that held her father. With trembling fingers, she straightened Mrs. Who's glasses and put her own in her pocket. Give them to me, came Charles's menacing voice, and he was in the cell with her, with Calvin on the outside pounding frantically to get in. Okay, guys, this is exciting. This means that Mrs. Who's glasses let them move through these invisible walls. And I also just want to remind you periodically that even though Charles Wallace sounds like a much older person when he talks, Charles Wallace is younger than kindergarten. Like, he is a little kid. Meg kicked at Charles Wallace and ran at the column. She felt as though she were going through something dark and cold, but she was through. Father, she cried, and she was in his arms. This was the moment for which she had been waiting. Not only since Mrs. Witch whisked them off on their journeys, but during the long months and years before, when the letters had stopped coming, when people made remarks about Charles Wallace, when Mrs. Murray showed a rare flash of loneliness or grief. This was the moment that meant that now and forever, everything would be all right. As she pressed against her father, all was forgotten except joy. There was only the peace and comfort of leaning against him, the wonder of the protecting circle of his arms, the feeling of complete reassurance and safety that his presence always gave her. Her voice broke on a happy sob. Oh, Father! Oh, Father! Meg! He cried in glad surprise. Meg, what are you doing here? Where's your mother? Where are the boys? She looked out of the column, and there was Charles Wallace in the cell, an alien expression distorting his face. She turned back to her father. There was no more time for greeting, for joy, for explanations. We have to go to Charles Wallace, she said, her words tense. Quickly. Her father's hands were moving gropingly over her face, and as she felt the touch of his strong, gentle fingers, she realized with the flooding of horror that she could see him, that she could see Charles in the cell and Calvin in the corridor, but her father could not see them, could not see her. She looked at him in panic, but his eyes were the same steady blue that she remembered. She moved her hand brusquely across his line of vision. He did not blink. Father, she cried, Father, can't you see me? His arms went around her in a comforting, reassuring gesture. No, Meg. But Father, I can see you. Her voice trailed off. Suddenly, she shoved Mrs. Who's glasses down her nose and peered over them, and immediately she was in complete and utter darkness. She snatched them off her face and thrust them at her father. Here! His fingers closed about the spectacles. Darling, he said, I'm afraid your glasses won't help. Oh, but they're Mrs. Who's. They aren't mine, she explained, not realizing that her words would sound like gibberish to him. Please try them, Father, please. She waited while she felt him fumbling in the dark. Can you see now? She asked. Can you see now, Father? Yes. he said. Yes, the wall is transparent now. How extraordinary. I could almost see the atoms rearranging. His voice had its old familiar sound of excitement and discovery. It was the way he sounded sometimes when he came home from his laboratory after a good day and began to tell his wife about his work. Then he cried out, Charles, Charles Wallace? And then, Meg, what's happened to him? What's wrong? That is Charles, right? Because remember, Mr. Murray has been gone for like 2 years. And so Charles was like a little bitty toddler baby when he left him. It has him, Father, she explained tensely. He's gone into it. Father, we have to help him. For a long moment, Mr. Murray was silent. The silence was filled with the words he was thinking and would not speak aloud to his daughter. Then he said, Meg, I'm in prison here. I have been for, Father, these walls, you can go through them. I came through the column to get into you. It was Mrs. Who's glasses. Mr. Murray did not stop to ask who Mrs. Who was. He slapped his hands against the transparent column. It seems solid enough. But I got in, Meg repeated. I'm here. Maybe the glasses help. The atoms are arranged. Try it, Father. She waited breathlessly, and after a moment, she realized she was alone in the column. She put out her hands in the darkness and felt its smooth surface curving about her on all sides. She seemed utterly alone, the silence and darkness impenetrable forever. She fought down panic until she heard her father's voice coming to her very faintly. I'm coming back for you, Meg. It was almost a tangible feeling as the atoms of the strange material seemed to part to let him through to her. In their beach house at Cape Canaveral, there had been a curtain between dining and living room made of long strands of rice. It looked like a solid curtain, but you could walk right through it. At first, Meg had flinched every time she came up to the curtain, but gradually she got used to it and would go running right through, leaving the long strands of rice swinging behind her. Perhaps the atoms of these walls were arranged in somewhat the same fashion. Put your arms around my neck, Meg, Mr. Murray said. Hold on to me tightly. Close your eyes and don't be afraid. He picked her up and she wrapped her long legs around his waist and clung to his neck. With Mrs. Who's spectacles on, she had felt only a faint darkness and coldness as she had moved through the column. Without the glasses, she felt the same awful clamminess she had felt when they tested through the outer darkness of Camazotz. Whatever the black thing was to which Camazotz had submitted, it was within, as well as without, the planet. For a moment, it seemed that the chill darkness would tear her from her father's arms. She tried to scream, but within that icy horror, no sound was possible. Her father's arms tightened about her, and she clung to his neck in a stranglehold, but she was no longer lost in panic. She knew that if her father could not get her through the wall, he would stay with her rather than leave her. She knew that she was safe as long as she was in his arms. And then they were outside. The column rose up in the middle of the room, crystal clear and empty. Meg blinked at the blurred figures of Charles and father and wondered why they did not clear. Then she grabbed her own glasses out of her pocket and put them on, and her myopic eyes were able to focus. Charles Wallace was tapping one foot impatiently against the floor. It is not pleased, he said. It is not pleased at all. Mr. Murray released Meg and knelt in front of the little boy. Charles, his voice was tender. Charles Wallace, what do you want? I'm your father, Charles. Look at me. The pale blue eyes seemed to focus on Mr. Murray's face. Hi, Pop, came an insolent voice. That isn't Charles, Meg cried. Oh, Father, Charles isn't like that. It has him. Yes, Mr. Murray sounded tired. I see. He held his arms out. Charles, come here. Father will make it all right, Meg thought. Everything will be all right now. Charles did not move toward the outstretched arms. He stood a few feet away from his father, and he did not look at him. Look at me, Mr. Murray commanded. No. Mr. Murray's voice became harsh. When you speak to me, you will say, no, father, or yes, sir. Come off it, pop, came the cold voice from Charles Wallace. Charles Wallace, who outside Camazotz had been strange, had been different, but never rude. You're not the boss around here. Meg could see Calvin pounding again on the glass wall. Calvin, she called. He can't hear you, Charles said. He made a horrible face at Calvin, and then he thumbed his nose. Who's Calvin? Mr. Murray asked. Meg started, but Charles Wallace cut her short. You'll have to defer explanations. Let's go. Go where? To it. No, Mr. Murray said. You can't take Meg there. Okay, so y'all, this is our stopping place for today. So the good news is we have found the dad. Yay, he's alive. The bad news is they're all still on the evil planet, and now Charles Wallace is going to go take them to it. So be good. Eat your fruits and vegetables. Don't be too crazy. And we will meet again next time. All right. Bye, guys.